Okay, let's jump in. Today we are doing a deep dive into, well, what many see as a foundational moment in human history, the return of the Jewish exiles to Jerusalem.
Right.
But we're looking at it through a different lens, not just as a spiritual event, but as this incredible master class in, extreme political maneuvering
And logistics. You can't forget the logistics. It's a classic case of nation building, basically from scratch.
from absolute scratch.
Yeah, and the sources we're analyzing, they really show that the return wasn't some kind of victory parade. It was a desperate scramble. You've got this small, completely demoralized population trying to rebuild an identity that had been just shattered.
They needed everything: infrastructure, spirit, direction.
All of it.
And that direction, it really came from two central figures. You have Ezra the priest, who's focused on the spiritual law. And then you have the main character of our story today, Nehemiah. He's the prepared man of action. And his political reach was, well, it was astonishing.
It really was.
So our mission today is to analyze Nehemiah's strategies, his leadership, his execution, and especially this one deeply controversial decision that our sources argue basically secured the survival and, believe it or not, the future global influence of the Jewish people.
And when you look at Nehemiah's background, the story gets even more dramatic. I mean, you have to understand, he wasn't just some local official.
Not at all.
He was the personal cupbearer to the Persian emperor, Artaxerxes I. And, that title sounds a bit ceremonial, but in practice, he was the king's most trusted aide.
His chief of staff, effectively.
Exactly. He had immense power, luxury. He was at the absolute epicenter of the ancient world.
So he's at the top of his game, the peak of his career. And what does he do? He essentially trades it all in for what looks like professional suicide.
That's a perfect way to put it. He actively sought the governorship of Judah. And you have to picture Judah at this time. It was a tiny, destitute, really unstable province.
A backwater.
A total backwater. We're talking maybe 50,000 people just living hand-to-mouth in the literal ruins of Jerusalem. So to go from the Persian court to that, it was a radical self-imposed demotion.
No sane career politician would ever make that move. So the sources are pretty clear on why he did it, this massive personal sacrifice.
Yeah.
What was the driving force?
It was pure, unadulterated heartbreak. He wasn't looking for a promotion. He wasn't looking for more wealth. He was just devastated by the reports he was hearing about his people.
The desperation, the vulnerability.
Yes, the destitution, the constant threat of attack. He had this sincere, profound concern for his kin, so much so that he was willing to risk his life, his station, everything, to push a rescue plan through the emperor.
And that sincerity, that's what convinces the king.
It's everything. That level of dedication is what gave him credibility. The king could see this wasn't about ambition. This deep personal responsibility is what got him the resources and the authority he needed.
So that sincerity is the first key to his leadership.
Yeah.
But when he finally gets to Jerusalem, what does he see as the immediate number one problem?
It was the walls.
No walls.
Protection. Exactly. A city without walls in the ancient world wasn't really a city. It was just a collection of vulnerable houses, basically a sitting duck waiting to be exploited. They were dealing with constant theft, raids, threats from all the regional powers around them. The very survival of the community hinged on securing its perimeter.
And this wasn't like patching up a fence. This was a monumental project.
Now, monumental is an understatement. The original wall had been destroyed by the Babylonians, 50 years earlier?
Right.
And the sources say that even the stones themselves had been scavenged. People had just taken them for other things. So we're talking about rebuilding a 5-kilometer perimeter. For the time, with their technology, it was one of the largest civil engineering projects you could even imagine.
The logistics sound terrifying.
They were.
Yeah.
But the primary challenge, and this is key, it wasn't the material. It was the psychology of failure. This community had already tried and failed to finish rebuilding the temple years earlier. And that failure it sapped their collective will. So when Nehemiah showed up, the people were just paralyzed by how big the wall project seemed.
Too big, too difficult.
Too overwhelming to even try. They were completely and utterly demoralized.
So how do you take a community that's broken, that's defeated, and get them to accomplish something impossible in record time? This is where his genius as a leader really kicks in. It's why he's still studied in leadership courses today.
His real skill was in transferring his own commitment to the people. He didn't just show up and start, barking orders. He actually spent 3 days in secret, under the cover of darkness, just assessing the wreckage himself.
Taking it all in.
Yes. Then he gathered the leaders. And he used that same sincerity, the proof that he had given up everything, to move their hearts.
The realization must have been incredible for them. Like, wait, this powerful man gave up the best job in the world, not for himself, but for us. That's a powerful motivator.
It creates instant, unassailable credibility. But Nehemiah knew that motivation wasn't enough. Timing was critical.
Right.
If the project dragged on, political opposition would build, people would get tired, external enemies would interfere. It would inevitably die. He knew the work couldn't be slow and steady. It had to be a total accelerated mobilization. They needed speed.
Massive speed. And his plan for how to achieve that speed was, well, it was brilliant. He turned this huge, overwhelming task into hundreds of tiny, manageable parts.
He did. Instead of one big labor force, he set up this meticulous system where he assigned specific sections of the wall to individual families, tribes, even professional guilds.
So it wasn't just go build the wall.
No, it was this localized ownership. That was the psychological trick. Think about it. A 5-kilometer wall, if you tell one person they have to finish the whole thing, they despair. But Nehemiah told each family, look, you only have to complete this 100-meter segment right here, the part outside your own house. You're just protecting your own family.
And that reframes the entire task. It's not an abstract political project anymore. It's personal.
Exactly. It becomes a personal, achievable, defensive goal. And it drove them to work relentlessly. They could see their own work directly contributing to their own safety. It created this incredible internal competition and dedication, a momentum that just couldn't be stopped.
But of course, the second that momentum started to build, the external threats showed up. And they were relentless.
Oh, yeah. The biggest opposition came from the provinces around them, especially Samaria. They saw a fortified, independent Judah as a direct threat to their own regional power.
So what did they do?
They tried everything. First, they went straight to the top. Political warfare, slander, and lobbying.
Classic moves.
Right. They sent letter after letter to the Persian emperor, and they didn't just complain about the wall. They flat out accused Nehemiah of inciting a rebellion. They kept reminding the king that, the Judeans had this long history of resisting foreign rule.
They were trying to get his permit revoked.
Yeah.
Get him recalled, or worse.
It was a high-stakes political chess match. And when the letters didn't work, when the building kept going, they resorted to direct sabotage.
Physical attacks.
Yes. Enemies would physically attack the builders, sometimes tearing down finished sections of the wall at night. This forced Nehemiah to come up with this really remarkable security response.
This is maybe the most famous image from the whole story, right? The builders working and fighting at the same time.
It is. They basically adopted this dual shift system. One group would be working while another group stood guard. Or, more often, the men would literally work with a tool in one hand and a weapon, a sword or a spear in the other.
I can't even imagine that. The level of constant stress.
They were always organized by family, working together, sleeping right there on site. The sources paint this picture of continuous vigilance, day and night. They knew one moment of complacency could cost them their lives and the entire project.
And when even that didn't work, the opposition escalated to the ultimate threat.
They went after Nehemiah himself.
The assassination plot.
They recognized he was the heart and the brain of the whole operation, so they tried to lure him out. They disguised it as dialogue and negotiation.
Let's talk.
Let's have a peace conference, a meeting in a neutral location. But Nehemiah knew it was just a thinly veiled death trap.
He saw right through it.
Completely. The sources note he was a person who didn't just react. He had this incredible foresight to look into their motives, so he just refused. He sent back that now legendary line that he was doing a great work and could not come down.
He just wouldn't play their game.
52 days. And the psychological victory was just as important as the physical one. The people who built it, they were astonished at what they'd accomplished. And their enemies, they were forced to recognize that this new community had a momentum that was, for now, unstoppable.
So Nehemiah recognizes this moment. The excitement. The relief over the wall. It's a critical window of opportunity that he has to seize immediately. The physical security is done, but the cultural and spiritual identity is still, fragile.
Exactly. And this is where Ezra the priest really takes center stage. Nehemiah leverages that high morale. He declares this huge public assembly during the Festival of Booths. But it wasn't just a party to celebrate the wall.
It was something more.
Much more. It was a spiritual and educational revival, all designed to solidify who they were.
And the sources describe this incredibly powerful scene. Ezra, standing on a central, elevated pulpit, reading the law.
And the crowd was enormous, tens of thousands. They obviously didn't have microphones, so they set up these surrounding platforms with men whose only job was to repeat Ezra's words, to amplify them, so that every single person in the assembly could hear the message.
Wow.
And this law, the Torah, you have to remember, it had been largely forgotten over 90 years of exile and war and just trying to survive. Hearing their own foundational principles read aloud after all that time, it caused this immense, spontaneous, emotional response.
People were weeping.
Yes, the people wept. They were moved to tears just hearing the words that were supposed to define them. And they listened for 7 straight days, sun up to sundown. They neglected food, they neglected rest. They were that desperate to absorb this rediscovered identity.
And the culmination of that whole week, it becomes the defining moment for their entire future.
Absolutely. After the week was over, the people took a communal oath, a public binding document promising to live strictly by the tenets of the law they had just heard.
And this moment, this is what many historians see as the real start.
It's widely viewed as the definitive starting point of Judaism as we understand it today. From this moment on, being a Jew wasn't just about your nation or where you were born. It was about a conscious, communal choice to adhere to a specific religious lifestyle.
So the wall is built, the spiritual revival is underway, they've laid the foundation. But according to our sources, the truly agonizing work, the real test, began immediately after, when they actually tried to implement this new law.
And that's when they discovered a massive, almost insurmountable problem that threatened to undo everything.
The crisis of the international marriages.
Yes. Many Judeans, and we're not just talking about everyday people, but high-ranking leaders, priests, influential families, had intermarried with non-Judeans from all the surrounding populations.
And the law, they had just sworn this sacred oath to uphold, strictly forbade that. So what was the practical reason for these marriages?
Well, the sources indicate they weren't always about romance. They were often very pragmatic business alliances.
Oh, of course.
Marrying into local families was a vital way to establish trade routes, to secure land, to provide some kind of financial stability in a world that was incredibly precarious. Their children basically served as political and economic collateral.
So they were faced with this impossible choice. Follow the law and destroy their fragile economy, or compromise the law to secure their finances.
And Nehemiah looked at this and realized this was the ultimate existential threat, more than any enemy army. He believed that if these mixed families and their political alliances were allowed to continue, the community would inevitably dilute its faith. It would absorb the surrounding cultures and cults within 1 or 2 generations.
And Judaism would just vanish.
It would just be absorbed and disappear. So the crisis demanded a solution. And the solution he chose was profoundly unpopular, immediate, and utterly uncompromising.
This is the big one.
This is the big one. Nehemiah concluded that survival required a brutal decree, the complete dissolution of these international marriages, a forced divorce policy. He used his supreme authority as governor, which was backed by that initial royal decree from the emperor, to enforce the religious law over every other practical human consideration.
And this is the decision that is still debated and, frankly, criticized so heavily today. It's seen as heartless, destructive to families, to the economy. He had to know the cost would be immense.
He absolutely did. But the sources argue that Nehemiah was acting as a long-view leader. He was looking far beyond the immediate economic crisis or the very real ethical challenge of breaking up families. He saw this highly unpopular, painful move as the absolute necessary price for maintaining a distinct Jewish identity.
So without that separation?
Without that separation, the 52-day wall would have just been a temporary barrier, quickly overwhelmed by internal cultural erosion from within.
So the argument from these sources is that Nehemiah's true enduring legacy isn't the wall, which was, eventually destroyed again anyway. It's his uncompromising, controversial policy of religious and cultural separation.
That is the ultimate conclusion of this analysis. It was this specific, painful policy that ensured this small, vulnerable population could maintain its distinct identity across 2,500 years of diaspora and persecution. This cultural firewall is what allowed the Jewish people to survive against all historical odds.
And eventually achieve the kind of global influence in finance, tech, and policy that we see today.
That's the argument. The sources claim that if you are looking for the functional starting point of the modern Jewish identity, you don't look at the temple. You look at Nehemiah's unflinching, painful decree of separation.
It's fascinating because the part of his legacy that arguably ensured the culture's very survival is the part that is most often ignored or the part that is most ethically challenging to our modern way of thinking. It really forces you to confront the complexity of history.
It really does. I mean, Nehemiah's story challenges our modern concepts of leadership, of ethics. He achieved long-term survival for his people through actions that caused immediate, immense personal suffering and economic hardship. And it leaves you with a really provocative thought to chew on.
Which is,
Well, if the greatest leaders are defined by their ability to ensure the long-term survival of their community, by the result achieved centuries down the line, should we judge them primarily by the standards of contemporary opinion? Or should we judge them by those ultimate, enduring results? Even if getting those results required deeply unpopular and to us ethically challenging actions in the moment. That's really the legacy Nehemiah leaves for us to consider.